The orphanage closed in 1911, but the lights are still on. Every December, the house had stood longer than anyone alive could remember. Its stone walls were darkened by soot and winter rain, and its roof sagged like a body grown tired of holding itself up, perched on a ridge at the far edge of a quiet European town. The orphanage seemed less like a place built for children and more like a sentinel that watched the valley below. Locals still called it the house on the hill, though its doors had been locked for more than a century. Even so, each December, when the air grew sharp and the nights stretched long, someone always swore they saw a faint glow behind its broken windows, a trembling light like candles flickering in a place that should have been empty. The town denied the stories in public, but the whispers persisted. The orphanage had closed in 1911 after a fire left the walls gutted, yet no one had ever dared to tear it down. It lingered as a scar, too dangerous to approach and too heavy with memory to destroy. Children dared one another to climb the hill at night, but even they never crossed the threshold. The grown remembered too much, though they claimed to know little. The building had once been hailed as a triumph of charity. In the mid-1800s, when factories had begun swallowing men and women and leaving children to fend for themselves, the orphanage had opened its gates with promises of shelter, food, and schooling. Its benefactor, Father Elias Marrow, had been celebrated as a saintly figure, a man who smiled gently and spoke with a voice so low and measured, it seemed designed to soothe even the most restless soul. His name was written in parish records beside donations, sermons, and town council notes that praised his devotion to the forgotten. He appeared in photographs standing among boys with clipped hair and pale girls holding hymn books, a hand resting lightly on their shoulders as if he were their guardian. No one questioned his patience or his warmth. To the town, he was a man beyond reproach. Yet to the children who lived inside those walls, there was another story, one that never reached the surface while the orphanage still breathed. It was only later, whispered in fragments, that people began to understand. The house was not what it seemed. The facade of goodness was flawless. The house was built with long windows that caught the morning sun, with dormitories lined neatly like barracks. The chapel bell rang daily, and townsfolk claimed they could hear the children singing hymns as they passed on the road below. Visitors described the place as disciplined but peaceful. Yet the truth was that almost no one had ever set foot beyond the common rooms. Inspections were infrequent, reports were written hastily, and the town preferred comfort over confrontation. In a century when children were seen more as burdens than as beings, the orphanage became a place to place them, to forget them. Behind its walls, silence grew heavy, and the silence itself was its greatest disguise. The legend of the December lights began only after the fire, but it reached back further. In the decades leading up to 1911, townsfolk claimed they often saw candlelight long after the children should have been asleep. Some said the glow pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and deliberate. Others swore they heard faint chanting, though when they drew closer, the hill gave back only wind. These stories were dismissed as superstition, yet the fact that so many had the same vision left a mark that could not be erased. No one spoke of it directly. They clung instead to Father Marrow's saintly image, as though by protecting his reputation, they were protecting their own comfort. To doubt him would mean admitting they had abandoned dozens of children into hands they barely knew. Doubt was too costly, so faith was easier. Time did not erase the shape of the building. Even after the fire, its walls held together, blackened but unbroken, as if refusing to release what had been sealed within. Children of later generations heard the stories passed down in uneasy tones, of doors that opened on their own, of glass panes that caught firelight though no one lived there, of laughter that echoed when the hill stood deserted. Each December, these stories sharpened, for that was the month the lights were seen most clearly. People spoke of them as if they belonged to the building itself, like a ritual continuing without hands to perform it. The house seemed alive, unwilling to let its memory fade. For those who dared to look too long, the orphanage inspired not only fear, but shame. There was always the unspoken knowledge that the building had once been trusted, cherished, praised as a place of mercy. The same walls that now unsettled the town had once been symbols of charity. What disturbed the villagers most was not that the building might be haunted, but that its past could be so clean on the surface and so rotten beneath. It was a mirror that reflected not just Father Marrow, but the blindness of all who had believed him. And so, silence again became their defense. They avoided the hill, avoided the questions, avoided the memory of faces lost. But the building did not allow silence. It glowed. It demanded to be seen, as though it wanted to keep its secrets alive. As the years turned to decades, the orphanage grew heavier in legend. The house on the hill became a story parents told to keep children close after dark. But behind the folklore, a truth lingered that no one fully confronted. Something had been done inside those walls, something cruel enough, deliberate enough, to stain even stone. The December lights were not a haunting, but reminder. One the town could never scrub away. And with each winter night, when a faint glow appeared in the windows, the people below felt the same quiet dread settle in their chests. That mercy had never lived there, only a mask that hid something unspeakable. The house waited, its walls hollow, its windows blind, yet every December it breathed again, whispering to those who chose not to listen. In the town's records, Father Elias Marrow was remembered not as a villain, but as a man of patience and grace. His face appeared in faded photographs, tall, thin, and always leaning slightly forward, as if bending closer to hear the needs of those around him. He wore his collar high and his spectacles low, his lips pressed in a faint smile that seemed to calm whoever stood before him. Mothers who surrendered their children to his care described him as tender, his voice measured like a lullaby that steadied the heart. They trusted him instantly, as though holiness radiated from the gentleness in his manner. He was called the gentle keeper, a shepherd for the lost. No one could imagine that beneath this mask of compassion lay something calculated, precise, and merciless. He knew how to play the role of savior. In Sunday sermons, he spoke of self-denial and purity, of children as candles to be shielded from the winds of sin. He quoted scripture with quiet authority, the kind that carried no thunder, but left people nodding in agreement, lulled into trust. When he walked the market streets, he touched shoulders lightly, always with a faint bow of the head, never too much to draw suspicion, never too little to seem cold. He donated bread to poor widows, delivered clothes for families in need, and kept careful notes of every act of generosity. His charity was so precise, it seemed curated, as though he were writing a record for history to find. And perhaps that was exactly what he intended. The town saw kindness because they wanted to believe in kindness. But those who looked more closely noticed that his eyes never warmed, not even when he held an infant in his arms. Behind the spectacles, his gaze was always measuring, calculating, studying. Inside the orphanage, his presence was constant. He walked the halls in silence, the sound of his shoes echoing against stone floors like a steady heartbeat. Children reported that he never raised his voice, never struck them, never cursed. Yet his quietness weighed more than violence could. When he entered a room, the air seemed to thicken, and children felt their own bodies stiffen without knowing why. His kindness was mechanical, rehearsed. He could speak gentle words while his hand lingered too long on a child's shoulder. His grip not firm, but controlling, as if testing how much resistance there might be. He did not appear angry or impatient. He appeared endlessly calm, and that calmness was what unsettled those who lived under it. The orphanage closed in 1911, but the lights are still on. Every December, the house had stood longer than anyone alive could remember. Its stone walls were darkened by soot and winter rain, and its roof sagged like a body grown tired of holding itself up, perched on a ridge at the far edge of a quiet European town. The orphanage seemed less like a place built for children and more like a sentinel that watched the valley below. Locals still called it the house on the hill, though its doors had been locked for more than a century. Even so, each December, when the air grew sharp and the nights stretched long, someone always swore they saw a faint glow behind its broken windows, a trembling light like candles flickering in a place that should have been empty. The town denied the stories in public, but the whispers persisted. The orphanage had closed in 1911 after a fire left the walls gutted, yet no one had ever dared to tear it down. It lingered as a scar, too dangerous to approach and too heavy with memory to destroy. Children dared one another to climb the hill at night, but even they never crossed the threshold. The grown remembered too much, though they claimed to know little. The building had once been hailed as a triumph of charity. In the mid-1800s, when factories had begun swallowing men and women and leaving children to fend for themselves, the orphanage had opened its gates with promises of shelter, food, and schooling. Its benefactor, Father Elias Marrow, had been celebrated as a saintly figure, a man who smiled gently and spoke with a voice so low and measured, it seemed designed to soothe even the most restless soul. His name was written in parish records beside donations, sermons, and town council notes that praised his devotion to the forgotten. He appeared in photographs standing among boys with clipped hair and pale girls holding hymn books, a hand resting lightly on their shoulders as if he were their guardian. No one questioned his patience or his warmth. To the town, he was a man beyond reproach. Yet to the children who lived inside those walls, there was another story, one that never reached the surface while the orphanage still breathed. It was only later, whispered in fragments, that people began to understand. The house was not what it seemed. The facade of goodness was flawless, The house was built with long windows that caught the morning sun, with dormitories lined neatly like barracks. The chapel bell rang daily, and townsfolk claimed they could hear the children singing hymns as they passed on the road below. Visitors described the place as disciplined but peaceful. Yet the truth was that almost no one had ever set foot beyond the common rooms. Inspections were infrequent, reports were written hastily, and the town preferred comfort over confrontation. In a century when children were seen more as burdens than as beings, the orphanage became a place to place them, to forget them. Behind its walls, silence grew heavy, and the silence itself was its greatest disguise. The legend of the December lights began only after the fire, but it reached back further. In the decades leading up to 1911, townsfolk claimed they often saw candlelight long after the children should have been asleep. Some said the glow pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and deliberate. Others swore they heard faint chanting, though when they drew closer, the hill gave back only wind. These stories were dismissed as superstition, yet the fact that so many had the same vision left a mark that could not be erased. No one spoke of it directly. They clung instead to Father Marrow's saintly image, as though by protecting his reputation, they were protecting their own comfort. To doubt him would mean admitting they had abandoned dozens of children into hands they barely knew. Doubt was too costly, so faith was easier. Time did not erase the shape of the building. Even after the fire, its walls held together, blackened but unbroken, as if refusing to release what had been sealed within. Children of later generations heard the stories passed down in uneasy tones, of doors that opened on their own, of glass panes that caught firelight though no one lived there, of laughter that echoed when the hill stood deserted. Each December, these stories sharpened, for that was the month the lights were seen most clearly. People spoke of them as if they belonged to the building itself, like a ritual continuing without hands to perform it. The house seemed alive, unwilling to let its memory fade. For those who dared to look too long, the orphanage inspired not only fear, but shame. There was always the unspoken knowledge that the building had once been trusted, cherished, praised as a place of mercy. The same walls that now unsettled the town had once been symbols of charity. What disturbed the villagers most was not that the building might be haunted, but that its past could be so clean on the surface and so rotten beneath. It was a mirror that reflected not just Father Marrow, but the blindness of all who had believed him. And so, silence again became their defense. They avoided the hill, avoided the questions, avoided the memory of faces lost. But the building did not allow silence. It glowed. It demanded to be seen, as though it wanted to keep its secrets alive. As the years turned to decades, the orphanage grew heavier in legend. The house on the hill became a story parents told to keep children close after dark. But behind the folklore, a truth lingered that no one fully confronted. Something had been done inside those walls, something cruel enough, deliberate enough, to stain even stone. The December lights were not a haunting, but reminder. One the town could never scrub away. And with each winter night, when a faint glow appeared in the windows, the people below felt the same quiet dread settle in their chests. That mercy had never lived there, only a mask that hid something unspeakable. The house waited, its walls hollow, its windows blind, Yet every December it breathed again, whispering to those who chose not to listen. In the town's records, Father Elias Marrow was remembered not as a villain, but as a man of patience and grace. His face appeared in faded photographs, tall, thin, and always leaning slightly forward, as if bending closer to hear the needs of those around him. He wore his collar high and his spectacles low, his lips pressed in a faint smile that seemed to calm whoever stood before him. Mothers who surrendered their children to his care described him as tender, his voice measured like a lullaby that steadied the heart. They trusted him instantly, as though holiness radiated from the gentleness in his manner. He was called the Gentle Keeper, a shepherd for the lost. No one could imagine that beneath this mask of compassion lay something calculated, precise, and merciless. He knew how to play the role of savior. In Sunday sermons, he spoke of self-denial and purity, of children as candles to be shielded from the winds of sin. He quoted scripture with quiet authority, the kind that carried no thunder, but left people nodding in agreement, lulled into trust. When he walked the market streets, he touched shoulders lightly, always with a faint bow of the head, never too much to draw suspicion, never too little to seem cold. He donated bread to poor widows, delivered clothes for families in need, and kept careful notes of every act of generosity. His charity was so precise, it seemed curated, as though he were writing a record for history to find. And perhaps that was exactly what he intended. The town saw kindness because they wanted to believe in kindness. But those who looked more closely noticed that his eyes never warmed, not even when he held an infant in his arms. Behind the spectacles, his gaze was always measuring, calculating, studying. Inside the orphanage, his presence was constant. He walked the halls in silence, the sound of his shoes echoing against stone floors like a steady heartbeat. Children reported that he never raised his voice, never struck them, never cursed. Yet his quietness weighed more than violence could. When he entered a room, the air seemed to thicken, and children felt their own bodies stiffen without knowing why. His kindness was mechanical, rehearsed. He could speak gentle words while his hand lingered too long on a child's shoulder, his grip not firm but controlling, as if testing how much resistance there might be. He did not appear angry or impatient. He appeared endlessly calm, and that calmness was what unsettled those who lived under it. It was the silence of someone who had already decided what would happen, long before others realized it. Outsiders adored him. Visitors were given carefully staged tours, children seated at desks, reciting lessons in perfect order, or lined up in dormitories where the blankets were folded with military precision. Each child was instructed to smile on cue, to sing when told, to bow their heads at his signal. Father Marrow always stood slightly to the side, letting the children's apparent happiness speak for him. Inspectors wrote reports that praised his discipline and order, noting how obedient the children were, how healthy they looked, how bright their manners seemed. No one asked why their smiles looked rehearsed. No one asked why they flinched slightly when his shadow crossed their faces. The inspectors left with full stomachs, their doubts smothered in courtesy, their signatures sealing another year of trust. Marrow understood human weakness. He knew that the town wanted relief from guilt more than they wanted truth. By presenting himself as a figure of mercy, He gave them a story they could cling to, a story that let them believe the children were safe, that abandonment could be sanctified by charity. He played the part so well that even those who sensed something darker found themselves silenced by doubt. After all, who would accuse a priest who had dedicated his life to children? Who would dare to stain the reputation of the gentle keeper? And so, silence settled around him like a cloak, stitched not only by his lies, but by the town's hunger to believe in them. Behind closed doors, he cultivated rituals of control. Each child was required to keep a journal, writing down thoughts before sleep, words that were later collected and locked away. He read them not to understand, but to measure, searching for fears, weaknesses, and attachments. He discouraged friendships, insisting that affection belonged only to God and to him as God's servant. Birthdays were erased. Children were told that such days distracted from purity. Instead, he gave them numbered tokens, each child reduced to a sequence in his ledgers. He was not careless with his cruelty. He was deliberate, weaving it into daily life until obedience became instinct, until individuality dissolved into silence. The most chilling detail was how easily he blurred kindness with control. He fed them bread laced with milk and honey, yet watched intently to see who swallowed too quickly, who hesitated at the taste. He praised children in public, but called them alone at night, whispering questions about loyalty and faith, pressing them to confess sins they had not committed. He convinced them that suffering was holy, that obedience was love, and that silence was salvation. To the town, he remained the gentle Father Marrow. To the children, he became a figure who lived inside their minds, a presence they could never escape, even when he was not in the room. In December, when the nights grew long, his mask of gentleness only deepened. He hosted festive gatherings with townsfolk, candle-lit evenings of hymns and warm bread. Visitors recalled the orphanage glowing with light, children singing in unison, Father Marrow watching proudly at the back of the hall. No one saw the exhaustion in the children's faces, the hollow eyes hidden by smiles. To the guests, it was a vision of mercy. To the children, it was a performance demanded by fear. And as the night ended, as the last guest left the hill, the doors closed, and the true orphanage continued unseen. The gentle keeper remained untouchable, shielded by the very image he had created. His kindness was his greatest disguise, his mask the perfect weapon. And with each December that passed, his control grew deeper, his methods sharper, his cruelty more refined. He was not the saint they believed. He was the silence they refused to hear. And the silence was only beginning. The disappearances did not begin with alarms or cries. They began with silence, a silence so ordinary that it slipped past notice. One winter morning, a child's bed stood empty. The blanket was folded, the pillow smoothed, as if no one had ever slept there. Father Marrow told the others that the boy had been adopted, taken by a family from the city. He smiled as he spoke, assured them that the child was now safe in a home filled with warmth. The children nodded, though their eyes dropped to the floor. None of them had seen a visitor arrive. None of them had heard a farewell. Still, the explanation was accepted because to doubt him was dangerous. And so, the first silence settled like frost, cold and thin, barely noticed. Weeks later, another bed emptied. This time, it was a girl, her possessions gone, her shoes missing from the line by the door. Again, Father Marrow announced she had been chosen by a family, blessed to leave behind the hardships of the orphanage. He praised her obedience, her purity, claiming it had won her favor in God's eyes. The children forced smiles, repeating the lie in whispers, as if repeating it might make it true. They did not dare ask questions, not even among themselves, because they had learned already that curiosity was punished with watchful stares and nights of prayer that lasted until dawn. Their bodies endured, but their voices were being buried. The town welcomed the stories of adoption. Mothers with too many mouths to feed and fathers broken by labor found comfort in the thought that some children were finding better lives. They did not notice that no new families appeared in the village. No letters were received, no faces returned to visit. The records spoke of transfers and placements, neat lines in ledgers with names crossed out and destinations written beside them. But those destinations were vague. To the city, to a farm, to service. No one ever asked for proof. The paperwork satisfied them, because the paperwork meant they did not have to think further. Silence was easier. Inside the orphanage, the children felt the disappearances like missing teeth. Each absence left the dormitories thinner, the hallways quieter, the prayers shorter. They whispered to themselves at night, asking whether the lost ones were truly safe or whether something darker had taken them. But Father Marrow's shadow loomed too large. He reminded them that God demanded obedience, that questioning was sin, that doubt led only to ruin. When another child vanished, he announced it with the same gentle smile, the same calm tone, as though speaking of a blessing. And each time the others bowed their heads, forcing themselves to believe, because belief felt safer than suspicion. Some of the children began to notice patterns. The ones who disappeared were often those who resisted, who wept at night, who clung to one another for comfort. They were children who longed too loudly, who asked too many questions, who carried too much of their old selves in their eyes. Marrow called them unready souls, though in public he called them chosen. He spoke of them as examples, urging the others to seek purity if they wished to be blessed. And so, the disappearances became both punishment and promise. They were warnings carved into absence, teaching the survivors that safety belonged only to those who submitted completely. For the town, the silences became routine. Every few months, another name left the register. Another story of adoption was told. No one noticed that no letters ever arrived. No families ever appeared to claim the gratitude of their gift. The villagers preferred the version that cost them nothing. To question would mean accusing a man who had buried their shame in kindness. To question would mean unearthing the truth that they had abandoned their children into hands they did not truly know. And so silence became collective, stretching beyond the orphanage walls, binding the entire town in complicity. What remained unspoken was the feeling that lingered in December. On those nights when the windows glowed faintly, some villagers swore they heard distant sounds carried by the wind. Not screams, but something worse, long, low sobs, the sound of children praying in unison, their voices trembling but unbroken. When asked about it, Marrow claimed it was a special devotion, a vigil for the season of birth, proof of the children's discipline. The villagers accepted it, though the unease never left their chests. They told themselves it was nothing, just the echo of wind through stone, the hill playing tricks on their ears. But deep down, the silence of the missing weighed heavier each year. The children who remained began to erase their own voices. They spoke less, laughed less, and even wept less. They trained themselves not to notice when a friend was gone, not to ask, not to remember. Forgetting became a form of survival, and survival was the only mercy left. Yet beneath the silence, fear thickened like damp air, clinging to every breath. Each child knew, though none dared say it aloud, anyone could vanish next. The beds stood as reminders, each empty mattress a warning carved into the fabric of their nights. The first silence had been small, a folded blanket, a missing pair of shoes. But as it spread, it grew into something larger than the children, larger than the town. It became a ritual of its own, a rhythm that carried death beneath the disguise of charity. The disappearances were no longer isolated events. They were part of a pattern that pulsed like a heartbeat through the orphanage, steady and relentless. And the town, blinded by faith and comfort, let the silence deepen, never realizing that every unspoken word was feeding the very thing that haunted the hill. By the time the year turned and the snow fell heavy on the roof, the silence had become a living presence inside the orphanage. It crept into every corner, filled every mouth, and spread like frost through the bones of every child. It was not only the silence of absence. It was the silence of complicity, the silence that comes when evil hides behind innocence, when cruelty wears the mask of mercy, and no one dares to look beneath. And in that silence, Father Marrow thrived. The fire that consumed the orphanage in 1911 left its walls scarred and hollow, but it also revealed things no one was meant to see. When investigators entered the charred remains, they found more than blackened stone and collapsed timbers. Beneath the floors, behind walls that should have been solid, there were spaces hidden with deliberate care. Some were narrow and suffocating, no larger than a cupboard, while others stretched like chambers, designed for purposes no one could name aloud. The air there was still thick with smoke, but beneath the soot lay carvings, symbols etched deep into beams, markings not of faith but of ritual. They were circles, triangles, and strange lines cut with a hand too steady to be casual. These rooms had been crafted for secrecy, concealed so well that without the fire they might never have been uncovered. And in them, investigators found evidence that silence alone could no longer contain. The first discovery was the chains. They were welded directly into stone floors, their iron rings blackened but intact. Some were small, fit for wrists or ankles. Others were wider, as though meant to bind a body by the waist or neck. The walls bore scratches, uneven and desperate, the kind that can only be made by fingernails pressed until they broke. The investigators noted them with unease but recorded nothing publicly. Instead, they wrote vague lines about unexplained structures and storage areas in official reports. The truth was left unsaid, but those who had walked into the hidden rooms carried the images with them for the rest of their lives. Tools were scattered across the floor, their shapes warped by fire, yet still recognizable. They were not instruments of carpentry or farming. Some resembled pincers, some blades, others more like rods bent into odd configurations. Their edges bore notches, their handles polished smooth by frequent use. These were not tools meant to build, they were meant to endure. The investigators could not say it plainly, but the implication was clear. These tools were crafted not for work, but for suffering. Every instrument looked as though it had been designed with a question in mind, as if someone had been studying not how to break stone or wood, but how to break flesh and spirit. More disturbing still were the shelves that lined certain walls. On them were glass jars, some shattered, others intact, their contents spoiled by heat. What survived were stains, dark rings that clung to the bottoms, and labels that had been written in a meticulous hand. Each bore a date, sometimes a name, sometimes only a number. The writing was steady, deliberate, as though each jar had been part of a catalogue. The record spoke not of chaos, but of order, the order of someone who believed their cruelty was a kind of science. What those jars once held could only be guessed, but the fact that they were stored, organized, and labeled told more than words ever could. Perhaps most haunting were the carvings in the wood. In one chamber, beams had been gouged with names, dozens of them, written by shaky hands. They were uneven, scratched with force, some so deep that splinters jutted outward. The names belonged to children who were never recorded as adopted. Children whose fates had been written out of the orphanage's ledgers. It was as if each child had been forced to carve their own existence before being swallowed by the silence. The carvings remained sharp even after the fire, preserved in the blackened wood like scars that could never fade. To stand among them was to feel the weight of lives raised, voices cut off but still screaming through the grooves of timber. One investigator, years later, admitted in private letters that the rooms did not feel merely human. He described a sensation of being watched, of the air itself pressing against his chest as though refusing to let him breathe. He wrote that the carvings and symbols looked less like expressions of madness and more like rituals, the workings of a mind that sought something beyond simple cruelty. He suggested that Father Marrow believed his acts were not only punishments or experiments, but offerings, sacrifices conducted with a precision that mimicked worship. The letter was never published, sealed away in archives, but it revealed a truth that officials refused to put into words. The orphanage had not simply been a place of neglect or abuse. It had been a machine built for suffering, guided by a mind that found purpose in pain. The hidden rooms transformed the story of the orphanage from rumor into horror. No longer could the disappearances be explained away by adoption or transfer. The chains, the jars, the carvings, these were not mistakes or accidents. They were evidence of something deliberate, something that had been hidden in plain sight while the town applauded the gentle keeper. Yet even with these discoveries, the silence continued. Officials released reports that softened the findings, describing the chambers as storage basements and ritual graffiti of unknown origin. They spoke of the fire as a tragedy, but not as an unveiling. The town, too, accepted this softened truth. To acknowledge the reality of the hidden rooms would mean admitting that they had abandoned their children to a place built for ritualized cruelty. Denial was easier than shame. Still, the hidden rooms did not vanish. Even after the fire, they remained part of the ruin. Children who wandered close to the hill swore they saw shapes move behind the blackened windows, swore they felt cold drafts where the earth should have been sealed. Some claimed that if you pressed your ear to the stone, you could still hear faint scratching, as though fingernails were dragging endlessly against wood. Whether these were tricks of the mind or remnants of something darker did not matter. The legend grew, and with it, the dread. The house on the hill was no longer simply a ruin. It was a monument to silence, to secrets too carefully built to be destroyed by fire. The hidden rooms revealed that evil does not always scream. Sometimes it hides in the smallest spaces, in symbols carved where no one looks, in chains buried beneath stone, in jars labeled and set neatly on shelves. The investigators who entered those chambers left with faces pale and eyes hollow, but they left without words. And so, the silence continued, even as the walls themselves seemed to speak. The hidden rooms were not just chambers of stone. They were mirrors, reflecting the depth of cruelty that can thrive when no one dares to question. And as the town turned away from what had been uncovered, the orphanage remained, its secrets sealed again in darkness, waiting for December to draw the lights back to life. Father Marrow's cruelty was not the kind born of sudden rage or careless neglect. It was cold, measured, and exact. He never raised his voice, never struck out in a storm of anger. To the townspeople, he was the very image of patience. A man who walked slowly with hands clasped behind his back, whispering prayers with the steady rhythm of breath. But within the hidden chambers of the orphanage, his steps changed. Down there, beneath the earth where no sound could escape, he moved with a surgeon's calm. Every action was prepared, rehearsed, and repeated until it felt less like violence and more like ritual. To him, pain was not chaos, it was a science. He began with silence. The first stage of his ritual always involved taking a child's voice. Some investigators would later claim to have found small bone needles and twine darkened by age, their points bent from repeated use. Witnesses who pieced together fragments of memory spoke of lips sewn shut in neat rows, not sloppily, but carefully, as if each stitch were part of a lesson. Children who endured this step were left alive, forced to sit in darkness, unable to cry out, learning that even their most human expression of suffering had been taken away. For Marrow, this silence was not punishment. It was preparation. He believed the absence of sound opened a space in the mind where fear multiplied endlessly, where a child's thoughts echoed louder than any scream. The second stage was the body's surrender. Records found decades later describe crude drawings of barrels filled with water marked with lines and dates. Notes that measured how long a body could endure suspension without collapse. Survivors whispered of salt poured until the water burned every cut, every open pore, until the baby no longer felt like its own. The children were lowered into these barrels, blindfolded, their mouth sewn, their arms bound, left to float in suffocating silence. Marrow would watch as they twisted, not drowning, but losing their sense of time and space. Hours could pass before he raised them out again, half-conscious, their skin swollen, their minds drifting between hallucination and reality. He recorded each detail, the time until fainting, the signs of delirium, the moment when fear broke into submission. Blood was his third element, not spilled in frenzy, but drawn in drops, carefully measured into glass vials. Dozens of them were found in the ruins. each labeled with dates and symbols, stacked in rows like a library of suffering. The fire destroyed most of their contents, but the method was clear. He did not drain quickly. He preferred the slow ritual of letting blood drip through small incisions, enough to weaken, never enough to kill outright. Each child's blood was collected as though it carried meaning, as though every drop was an offering in a ritual that only he understood. Some jars were marked with single letters, others with fragments of Latin prayers, suggesting that to him these were not experiments alone, but something closer to sacred tokens. One account, pieced together from hidden notes, described a chamber where children were forced to kneel before shelves of these vials. They were told to watch their own life drip away, to know that their existence had been reduced to liquid stored in glass. The effect was more than physical. It was the breaking of hope, the stripping of identity. A child no longer belonged to themselves, but to the collection, their blood catalogued alongside countless others. To Marrow, this was proof of mastery. The body, the voice, even the very essence of life could be contained, labeled, and ordered under his control. But his rituals did not end with the body. He sought to conquer the mind. Investigators later uncovered wooden boxes with holes cut into them, boxes that once covered heads, fitted with wires and small metal chimes. Witnesses described how sound was used not as comfort, but as torment. Endless ringing, low humming, and sudden bursts of noise repeated until the child's sense of reality fractured. Some boxes were lined with mirrors so that when lifted away, the child's first vision was of their own swollen, distorted face. Others bore marks of wax dripped inside, where heat would creep down the skin while the chimes rang. These methods had no place in religion, no place in medicine. They were the creations of a man who wanted to map suffering as if it were a secret language only he could read. The rituals always followed a pattern, and this pattern gave him control. He never varied his steps, never rushed, never allowed chance to guide him. Silence, surrender, blood, sound. Each stage was repeated until it resembled liturgy, a dark mass carried out in chambers beneath the smiling halls of the orphanage above. Children learned quickly that resistance meant nothing. The sequence would unfold with or without their will. This inevitability was his final cruelty, for it stripped them not only of freedom, but of meaning. They were no longer children in his eyes. They were materials, vessels for his ritual, pages in the ledger of his hidden scripture. The townspeople, of course, knew nothing. Above ground, they saw the children sing hymns and walk in orderly lines. They saw Father Marrow's soft voice and gentle nods. They saw the perfect picture of devotion. What they could not see was the cost of this order, the price of every hymn sung in harmony. Marrow had made suffering his discipline, his sacred order, and because it was methodical, it remained invisible. Frenzy could be noticed, chaos could be suspected, but discipline hid beneath the mask of piety, and his evil thrived because it was systematic. The hidden journals recovered after the fire revealed fragments of his thinking. In them, he wrote of thresholds, of testing how much silence a soul could endure before it collapsed, of how long a body could cling to life when bled in fractions rather than torrents. He compared children to candles, writing that their lives could be trimmed and measured, their flames bent without being snuffed. He believed suffering revealed truths hidden from ordinary sight. Pain, to him, was not destruction, but illumination. Each ritual was his way of reaching towards something beyond mortality, something he believed God had hidden in the cries of the innocent. What remained most terrifying was not the physical evidence, but the order itself. The jars, the chains, the boxes, all were horrific, but it was the system, the repetition, the perfect sequence that revealed his true mind. This was not madness. Madness destroys itself. His cruelty was disciplined, careful, written like scripture across the walls of hidden rooms. It was the work of a man who believed his rituals mattered, who found meaning in every stitch, every drop, every scratch carved by trembling hands. And so, the children of the orphanage did not simply vanish. They were consumed into a process, transformed into offerings in a ritual only Marrow believed could unlock the mysteries of suffering. His acts were not crimes of passion, but steps in a ceremony he conducted with the patience of a saint. And though the orphanage would one day burn, the memory of these rituals lingered in the ashes, proof that evil is at its most dangerous, not when it rages, but when it prays. Father Marrow's mind had long since left the language of morality. He no longer thought in terms of kindness or cruelty. In the dark ledger of his thoughts, children were not wards to be cared for, but subjects to be studied. Pain in his eyes was not punishment, but discovery. The cellar beneath the orphanage did not echo with screams alone. It echoed with the slow scratching of ink against paper, where he recorded each reaction, each tremor, each collapse of the body as though he were a physician pursuing knowledge. Yet there was no healing in his notes, no cures hidden in his studies. His science was not meant to save lives, but to stretch them into prolonged demonstrations of suffering, to learn how far life could bend before it broke. He began with nourishment, twisting something as basic as food into a tool of control. Children were fed bowls of warm milk, sweet enough to taste safe, yet each portion carried a measured spoon of ash. The ash came from the orphanage's own furnace, sifted so finely that it blended unnoticed into the pale liquid. At first, the children drank it without resistance, but soon their bodies grew sluggish, their stomachs tight with cramps, their mouths lined with a strange dryness that no water could quench. Marrow kept careful record of how long a child could last on nothing else, how their skin grew pale, how their eyes sank, how their voices weakened into whispers. He noted the days when the first teeth loosened, when the hair began to fall, when the muscles wasted away. He wrote it all without judgment, as if the decay of a starving child were no different than the pages of a textbook. Next, he turned to the manipulation of skin and flesh. He wanted to understand how the body reacted to extremes of temperature. And so he built his own instruments. Buckets of freezing water were hauled down each morning, and slabs of ice cut from the winter river were lowered into the cellar. Children were stripped and forced to press their limbs against the ice, held there until their skin blistered white and their blood slowed to a crawl. Then, just as their bodies began to stiffen, he would douse them with boiling rags, not to end their pain, but to reverse it. Flesh swelled, cracked, and peeled in ways he carefully described in his notes. He observed how fingers turned black and brittle after repeated sessions, how ears shrank and split, how skin lost all feeling before sudden heat made it scream again. For him, these were not tortures, but trials, like an alchemist testing the limits of matter. The human body was his element, and suffering was his flame. Sound was his next obsession, and in this, his cruelty turned inward, attacking the fragile workings of the mind. He constructed chambers of wood and iron where children were placed in darkness, the air filled with relentless tones. Some were subjected to a low, unending hum, vibrating in their bones until the silence of their own thoughts became unbearable. Others were forced to endure high-pitched whines that pierced their skulls, played at intervals just long enough to keep them on edge, never knowing when the next sharp cry would split the air. Days passed like this, marked only by sound, until children lost the ability to track time, their minds unraveling into confusion and terror. When he finally removed them, their eyes darted wildly. Their words stumbled into nonsense, and many never returned to reason again. He wrote that sound, more than pain, was the true master of the human mind. Flesh could resist, bone could resist, but the mind, when forced to live in noise, collapsed faster than any muscle. Every experiment was recorded with precision. Notebooks found years later, though scorched by fire, revealed his careful columns: weight, pulse, time until fainting, time until vomiting, days until hallucination. He gave each subject a number rather than a name, stripping even identity from his victims. To him, they were not children but living vessels of data. His handwriting was clean, his lines perfectly straight, his records almost beautiful in their order. And it was this order that horrified investigators most. This was not frenzy. This was not madness in the sense of chaos. It was discipline, as if cruelty itself had been bound into method. Marrow's fascination with endurance pushed him further into slow experiments, designed not to kill, but to stretch the body beyond what should have been possible. He discovered ways to draw life out like a candle's last flame. One child was kept alive for weeks with nothing but the ash-laced milk, their pulse dwindling until they seemed more shadow than flesh. Another was forced through endless cycles of freezing and thawing until their skin hardened like cracked parchment. Still another endured days inside the sound chamber, emerging with a mind so broken that they laughed at their own wounds. Marrow watched, measured, and noted each collapse as though the human soul itself were his specimen. What made his science most terrifying was the slowness of it. Death was never swift. He saw no value in the sudden extinguishing of life. Instead, he perfected the art of suspension, keeping his victims balanced at the edge of survival, never allowing them the release of death until every observation had been gathered. He believed that the final moments of life were meaningless compared to the long unraveling before it. To him, the truth of suffering lay not in the instant of death, but in the drawn-out process of approaching it. Above ground, he was the same patient figure the townspeople adored. He blessed their meals, touched their children's heads with gentle hands, and spoke of mercy and salvation. No one saw the ink stains beneath his nails. No one smelled the faint trace of ash that clung to his robes. His science was hidden, buried beneath the floorboards of faith, and this concealment gave it power. He could walk among the living, admired and trusted. while below him the cellar turned into a laboratory of human despair. When investigators pieced together fragments of his notes decades later, they found phrases that read less like research and more like doctrine. He wrote that the body was a gate, that pain was the key, and that only through slow endurance could the soul be revealed. He compared his work to scripture, claiming that every scream was a verse, every wound a word in a holy language that only he had the courage to read. His science was not science at all. It was faith twisted into calculation, a liturgy of suffering disguised as research. By the time his rituals reached their height, the children no longer prayed for rescue. They prayed for silence, for stillness, for an end to the endless trials that stretched their bodies and minds beyond recognition. For them, the orphanage was no longer a place of shelter, but a laboratory where life itself was studied until it broke. And as Father Marrow closed another vial or stitched another note into his ledger, he believed he was not destroying them, but uncovering truths that the rest of the world was too blind to see. And so, the orphanage became two places at once. A haven above, where the town saw order and piety, and a chamber below, where the science of pain was perfected in secret. The line between ritual and experiment blurred, until there was no difference between prayer and torture, no difference between data and agony. For Father Marrow, it was all the same. Each act was a step deeper into the hidden scripture of suffering, a scripture he alone believed he had been chosen to write. December carried a weight inside the orphanage that could not be measured in weather or season. The frost outside, the quiet snowfall, the stillness of the town, none of it compared to the chill that seeped through the walls of Father Marrow's institution. For the children, December was not a month of celebration or candles in windows. It was the time when the cellar came alive. Survivors, few as they were, later whispered that they could sense it coming, as though the building itself began to hum with a strange anticipation. The air grew heavier, the priests grew quieter, and Marrow himself seemed to walk with a new purpose. It was the month of the tests, the month when the cellar lit with dozens of flames, each burning not to give warmth, but to watch. The rituals always began with the carving. Each child was led into the cellar and given a small crude blade. They were told to inscribe their names into the wooden beams that supported the ceiling. No one knew why, and Marrow never explained. His instructions were calm, steady, spoken like commands of faith. The children cut their names into the wood, some clumsily scratching only the first letters, others digging deep as if by carving hard enough, they could prove their existence mattered. The beams became crowded with names, layer upon layer of letters etched into the groin. Those who carved returned to the dormitories changed, silent, trembling, eyes fixed on the floor, as though they had left something of themselves in that basement. Those who did not return left only their names behind, gouged into wood like desperate fingerprints. It was the candles that marked the true beginning. Marrow lit them one by one, a long line of wax set into iron holders around the cellar walls. Each flame burned steady, casting a pale glow across the room that never seemed to warm the air. Survivors swore that the cellar felt colder when the candles were lit, as if the fire did not fight the dark but invited it closer. The glow revealed everything: the damp stone, the wooden beams carved with children's names, the buckets of salt water, the vials and rags and instruments that were hidden during the rest of the year. Nothing remained in shadow. The candles turned the cellar into a stage, and each child brought down into that light became the unwilling performer. The test itself was never the same. Sometimes it began with water. Children were lowered into the salt-filled barrels, their lips sewn shut so no scream could escape as the brine seeped into their nostrils and burned their throats. Their minds soon broke into visions, and Marrow observed each shiver, each violent jerk, as though he were watching not a child but a specimen caught between two worlds. Other times the test was fire. Cloth soaked in oil was passed across their skin, not lit to consume, but heated just enough to sear flesh into blister. He would trace patterns, long lines and shapes, as if drawing scripture onto their bodies. He believed the pain etched truths into their souls, and he studied these marks like holy texts. The candles never wavered. Survivors remembered staring at them as they endured, fixating on the flames because to look at Marrow was worse. His eyes reflected those small fires, and when he leaned close, it felt as though he carried the light of the cellar inside him, a light that sought to hollow them out. The cruelest part was the silence he kept. He did not shout. He did not rage. His rituals were steady, measured, as though he were guiding the children through a sacred rite that only he understood. To him, their suffering was not cruelty, but offering, and he believed that every drop of blood, every carved name, was a prayer rising into the cold December air. The carvings on the beams became a kind of graveyard. Names of those who never returned stared out at the next child, forced to scratch their letters into the wood, some carved with shaking hands, unable to finish. Others gouged so deep that splinters cut their fingers, leaving stains of blood pressed into the grooves. The cellar became a ledger of the lost, each name a silent scream waiting to be joined by the next. And still, every December, new names were added. Years later, when the orphanage was abandoned, villagers who dared to enter swore they saw those names in the beams. The wood had darkened with time, but the letters remained sharp as though carved yesterday. Some beams carried dozens of marks, one child's name cutting through another, fighting for space, for memory. The air in the cellar was stale, yet when December came, candles seemed to relight themselves. Passers-by claimed to see a faint orange glow in the windows of the long-closed building, a glow that matched no hearth or lantern. Always in December, always near the cellar. Marrow's obsession with ritual was never about the individual act of pain. It was about repetition, about turning suffering into liturgy. December was the month when faith and cruelty became indistinguishable, when his experiments transformed into ceremonies. He believed the flames revealed truths hidden in the dark, that the carved names anchored the children's souls to the wood, preventing them from leaving until they had been tested. To him, the orphanage itself was a temple, and the cellar its altar. Each December was a season of harvest, where innocence was stripped away and offered to a God that existed only in his own fractured mind. The survivors carried December with them for the rest of their lives. Some could not bear the sight of a candle, extinguishing them, even at funerals or vigils. Others avoided carving their names anywhere, refusing to sign papers, refusing even to write. They feared that placing their names in wood or stone would summon the cellar back, as if Father Marrow's ritual had bound them forever to that basement. Their stories were fragmented, whispered in corners, often dismissed as madness. But the scars on their bodies, the strange patterns burned into skin, told of truths that no one wanted to believe. What remains today is not only the memory of those rituals, but the evidence carved deep into timber. Visitors who descend into the ruin claim to feel watched, to hear faint scratching sounds, as if a blade is still at work, cutting letters into wood. Some say they can smell melted wax, though no candle burns. Others swear the air tastes of salt. Each December, when the nights are longest, the glow returns, faint but visible through the broken windows. The town refuses to speak of it. Yet they all know. The orphanage closed in 1911, yet its lights still come on, as if Father Marrow's rituals continue in silence, waiting for new names to be added to the beams. And so, the month of December became more than a date on a calendar for those who knew the truth. It became a haunting, a season that carried within it the weight of all those lost. The flames still flicker in memory, the names still press from wood like scars, and the cellar waits in silence. Above ground, the snow covers everything, clean and white. But below, the beams whisper with the marks of the vanished, and the light of December still burns. The fire that consumed the orphanage in 1911 came as a shock to the town. But those who lived nearby would later speak of something that didn't match the official story. It was reported as an accidental fire, a simple mishap, a spark that had set the building ablaze in the dead of winter. But the townsfolk knew something else. They had heard it before the flames. Screams, distant at first, as if carried by the wind, but growing louder, more desperate. They spoke of voices rising from the cellar, the deep throats of children who could no longer keep their silence. Some said they heard a heavy thudding, as if something heavy were being dragged across the floors beneath. The fire, they said, didn't start in the usual places. It began in the cellar, a place where no one should have been able to enter without notice. And it burned hot, faster than any building should have burned, the flames reaching up into the sky, as though they were clawing for something inside. But the fire did not destroy everything. When the smoke finally cleared, there were no bodies. The charred ruins of the orphanage remained, but the children were gone. The records, hastily compiled in the wake of the disaster, said accidental fire, but the town didn't believe it. No one believed it, not after what they had heard in those moments before the flames took hold. The bodies were never recovered, and it was as though the fire had swallowed them whole, leaving nothing but ashen memory. No bones, no clothing, not even the faintest trace of life. The officials spoke of a few unidentifiable remains, some charred clothing, but nothing that would suggest the final moments of the children who had lived there. It was as though they had never existed at all, as though the fire had consumed them not just physically, but spiritually, erasing them from the world altogether. And yet, there were whispers that the children had not vanished into smoke. They had simply disappeared. The townspeople were left to wonder what had really happened inside the orphanage on that final night. The flames had been fierce, but they were not what had caused the fear. It was the silence that followed, the absence of answers. When Father Marrow's body was not found among the ruins, it only deepened the mystery. Some said they saw his figure in the windows in the days leading up to the fire, his face pale but calm, staring out at the snow-covered streets as if he knew the end was near. Others claimed they heard him moving through the halls, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. But when the fire had ravaged the building, there was no trace of him. Not even a scrap of clothing, not a single charred bone. His disappearance was complete, and that was the part that haunted the town the most, because no one could be sure if he had died in the fire or if he had simply vanished. In the days following the fire, a small group of townsfolk ventured to the orphanage ruins. They dug through the ash, searching for something, anything, to prove that the children had not simply been erased from existence. They found nothing, not a single body, not a scrap of clothing. The only thing that remained were the blackened beams, the charred remains of walls that had once held the names of the children carved into the wood, the marks of their desperation. Those names, so carefully etched, so deeply gouged, had all but disappeared, the flames licking at them as they had once licked at the children's bodies. Some of the survivors would later say that they could still feel the names pressing against their skin, as if the wood had absorbed the last remnants of their lives. They said they could hear the scratching of nails on wood, the faint echoes of children carving their names into the beams, the sound that had come before the flames, before the silence. But the disappearance of Father Marrow was perhaps the most chilling detail. No one knew what had happened to him. Some speculated that he had simply fled, escaped in the midst of the fire. But others wondered if he had been consumed by the flames, just as the children had. His absence felt like a dark promise, a final act in a ritual that had gone unfinished. Had the fire been a culmination of his work, or had it been something far darker, something that even he had not foreseen? The town was left with questions, none of which could be answered. And the children who had lived there, whose names were carved into the beams, were they gone forever? Had they perished in the fire, or had they simply vanished into the night? Some believed that the fire had been a cleansing, that the flames had consumed everything that was left of Father Marrow's work, leaving behind nothing but the scorched remnants of a terrible past. Others believed that the children had been taken, that the fire had been a distraction, a means of hiding something far worse. They spoke of shadows, of figures moving in the smoke, of whispers that were carried on the wind long after the flames had died down. But no one ever knew for certain. No one could say. As the town tried to move on, the orphanage was forgotten. Its ruins were abandoned, its memory left to fade into the snow. Yet the whispers remained. The fire had consumed so much, yet it had left something behind, something that could not be erased. The children's names, those desperate carvings in the wood, those marks that had once been symbols of identity, now seemed like warnings, like something that would never be forgotten. It was as though the fire had not destroyed the orphanage, but instead had made it more real. It had turned it into a place of memory, a place that would not fade, no matter how hard the town tried to bury it. The collapse of 1911, the fire that took the orphanage, became a mark on the town's soul. It became a reminder that some horrors are too deep to burn away, too real to erase. And Father Marrow's name, his absence, lingered like smoke in the air, a shadow that the town could never escape. For some, the fire was the end of a nightmare, but for others, it was only the beginning. For years, after the orphanage was reduced to ash, the truth of what happened within its walls was buried, sealed behind the quiet walls of bureaucracy and indifference. The town moved on, leaving the ruins to decay beneath the weight of snow, and the officials, who had once been eager to put the tragedy behind them, locked away the most damning evidence. Letters from the children, their voices frozen in time, journals that contained the fevered ramblings of Father Marrow, and ledgers that chronicled each twisted experiment. Everything was confined to an archive. The documents were buried in dusty corners of government buildings, tucked away in forgotten files, sealed with the promise of silence. The townsfolk had made an unspoken agreement with themselves. The story would die with the building. Father Marrow's name would fade from memory, and the children who had suffered in that hell would vanish into obscurity. But no matter how deep the silence sank, there were always those who couldn't forget. The archive was meant to keep the past contained, but secrets have a way of slipping out, leaking through cracks in the walls. A few pages found their way into the hands of those who had no right to them. Some of these documents were passed around in hushed tones, too explosive to be ignored, but too dangerous to expose publicly. They were whispered about in bars, exchanged in dark corners, and then locked away once more. But the truth had already begun to creep back into the light. Those who knew the full story, those who had survived the orphanage's horrors, had long since left the town, but not without leaving traces behind. And so, the story began to unspool like a forgotten nightmare, too persistent to be erased. Among the pages that leaked was a letter penned in a child's shaky handwriting, folded and hidden in one of the confiscated journals. The ink was smudged, the paper frayed at the edges, but the words were still legible. It read simply, "Father Marrow doesn't let us speak. If we do, he makes us carve our names into the walls. I'm afraid I don't want to be next." It was unsigned, but it didn't need to be. The fear in the words was enough. These letters, these desperate cries for help, began to surface in odd places, discovered by the very few who dared to ask questions. Some of them were nearly impossible to decipher, scribbled hastily by children in the throes of fear, but each contained a piece of the puzzle, a clue to the suffering hidden beneath the polished surface of the orphanage. The journals, too, told a story of methodical terror. Father Marrow's notes were cold, scientific, almost clinical in their observation of suffering. He referred to the children as subjects, and his experiments were not cruel whims, but carefully structured tests, each more horrifying than the last. He documented their responses to sensory deprivation, to pain, to hunger. He wrote of how long it took for a child to lose their ability to speak after their lips were sewn shut, how the human body reacted when kept in darkness for days on end. His obsession with documenting every moment of anguish was meticulous. as though he believed that by studying the limits of suffering, he could unlock some hidden truth about the human soul. He believed that pain was a doorway to a higher understanding, and he was determined to chart every inch of that path. The ledgers, the most damning of all, listed the names of each child who had been subjected to his experiments, their ages, their physical condition, and the date on which they were tested. There were columns for the duration of their suffering, notes about their physical decline, and, most chilling of all, the final column labeled termination, a euphemism for death. But no one had ever seen the full ledgers. The pages that slipped through the cracks were only fragments, a glimpse into a darkness that few had dared to acknowledge. The full scale of what happened inside the orphanage remained locked behind a sealed vault of official silence, too dangerous to confront, too overwhelming to admit. And so, the truth festered in the shadows. The town, forever scarred by the events, tried to move on, but the legacy of the orphanage clung to it like a curse. The officials who had sealed the files knew that the past was something that could not be buried forever. But they also understood the power of silence. There were certain truths, certain horrors that were better left forgotten. The story of Father Marrow and his experiments was one of those truths. The less that was said, the better. They believed that time would dull the edges of the horror, that the whispers would fade, that the children's names would vanish into oblivion, just like their bodies. But it never worked that way. The truth has a way of resurfacing, of clawing its way back into the light, no matter how deep the graves or how tightly the doors are shut. As the years passed, more documents leaked, more letters surfaced, and the whispers grew louder. The names of the children were spoken in hushed tones, passed like secrets between strangers who understood what the official history could never explain. And yet, for every piece of evidence that emerged, there were more that remained hidden, locked away in archives and basements, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. But it wasn't just the truth of the orphanage that couldn't be buried. It was the evil that lingered in its walls, the unseen presence that had haunted the children who had lived there, the shadow that Father Marrow had cast over the town. His name, his experiments, his rituals, they had all been carefully erased from the collective memory, but something still remained. It was in the way the town held its breath whenever the subject of the orphanage came up, in the way the streets seemed to grow quieter on cold winter nights. Father Marrow's legacy was not something that could be sealed away in an archive. It was something that would live on in the cracks and whispers, in the half-forgotten names carved into the beams. The fire had not burned away the darkness. It had only spread it, scattering the ashes across the town, where they would settle for years to come. Years passed, and the town grew, though it never quite grew free of the past. In the wake of the fire, the officials made their quiet decisions, and the public, eager to forget, moved on with a deep reluctance buried in their hearts. A small plaque was placed near the site of the orphanage, nothing more than a simple tribute to those who had perished. An attempt at closure without ever truly acknowledging what had happened. The plaque carried only vague words, in memory of the children lost in the fire. No names, no specifics, just a broad, hollow statement that spoke to nothing and no one. There was no true memorial for the lost children, no dedicated space for the memory of those who had endured Marrow's experiments. Families, if any, still remained, never received the answers they sought. They were told that the fire had taken everything, that the children had been swallowed by the flames. But no mother or father could ever truly believe that. The truth lingered like the smoke, heavy and thick, a truth they were never meant to find. The laws governing orphan care changed in the years that followed, but the changes were quiet, hidden beneath the weight of the tragedy. New regulations were passed, and the treatment of children became more humane. But those laws were crafted not from empathy, but from the need to make the past disappear, to ensure that something like Father Marrow's reign would never happen again. Yet no law could erase the scar that remained, the whisper of rituals that still seemed to echo in the town's very air. Despite the attempts at healing, something would never be right. The survivors, those few who had seen the inside of the orphanage and lived to leave, never fully integrated into the town. They kept to themselves, their eyes haunted by something the rest of the town couldn't see. They felt it in the cold of winter, in the way the wind seemed to carry distant screams when the snow fell. And every December,